Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Advancing with Watercolor. I'm Gary Tucker, and today I'm going to be talking about perspective and how the artist uses perspective to create depth in a painting. We have an unusual view today of a marketplace still in Venice. I couldn't get away from Venice. I'm still painting Venice. And it's unusual because it's looking down upon the scene. And I want to show you some of the things that we look for when we're in front of our motif, and some of the things that we think about when we're drawing or sketching our motif and we want to portray a particular perspective. I think this will be helpful for you when you are working in the field in an urban environment that involves architecture. When you have a chance, have a look at the description below this video, which will have a link to a PDF file that describes the concepts I'm talking about in a little greater detail and with examples. That should help you to understand some of the concepts that I'm presenting today. Today's topic is creating depth in a painting. And we use several things to do this in today's piece. Have a look at the photograph from the Ponte della Guglie in Venice. And it's quite complex, but there are some things that we can pick up on it. I'm going to show you a sketch in a second here. A very loose sketch to illustrate some of the lines that I'm using to line up my windows, line up rooftops, line up the awnings that extend off of the buildings, and even line up the bottoms of the buildings. So one of the first things that helps me to do this is establishing the horizon line. Since I'm at a height, I'm looking basically from the second floor down onto the marketplace. Figuring out the horizon line is pretty easy, and then I use these descending marks to help me establish the rooftops, the lines of the windows. These are all descending towards the horizon because they're above my line of sight. Below my line of sight, the lines are ascending, and this is the lower windows, the awnings, and the bottoms of buildings. So having that horizon line in place helps me to evaluate those lines and place them. Another thing that helps to create depth is using repeated shapes and let them diminish as they move toward the back, as I have with the awnings and the windows in this case. And we can also use figures in the same way. They're larger towards the foreground, and as they get far away, they get smaller. In this particular case, the figures are rising in the picture as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit as I'm doing the drawing here. You can see I'm working from my tonal study up in the right-hand corner, which is giving me guidance as to how I want to create the light in the painting. But I'm establishing those lines that I was just talking about, these ascending lines and descending lines. And this is related to a larger subject called perspective. In perspective, artists use a presumptional point in space called a vanishing point, and the lines that are basically this vanishing point rests on the horizon at a distance away from the buildings, and the angled lines of rooftops and windows all descend to that line. So they all meet at one point in space on the horizon line called the vanishing point. And if you get into engineering or architecture or drafting of any sort, this becomes really important and a very exact way of measuring and establishing these lines that help us to create perspective. But from an artist's point of view, I feel that they can be cumbersome. So I encourage my students, and I do myself, I estimate or guesstimate, if you want to use that word. I have in mind an angle that needs to be rendered steeper as it climbs higher in the painting, and flatter as it reaches the horizon line. Then, if the lines are coming below the horizon line, again, they're shallower as they're closer to the horizon line and steeper as they move away from the horizon line. Those are thoughts that I'm keeping in my mind as I'm laying out the drawing. And in this particular painting, the drawing plays a very important role, which is why I'm showing you more on how I'm putting the drawing together. Of course, I work from the big shapes to the smaller shapes, establishing the buildings, and then smaller shapes that fit into those buildings, such as windows and awnings and anything else that is going to be attached to the building. And then on top of that, I'll render the figures and even smaller elements. So putting the drawing together took some time, and I hope you can see in this piece how the lines are used to line up windows and create a diminishing aspect. So the windows are larger and darker as they come towards us. As they move away from us, smaller, and they're going to be lighter in tone. So this is the finished drawing, and I'm ready to start to paint. And I feel comfortable going forward that I've established the sort of perspective that I want. I should mention that Venice is laid out in kind of a weaving and wandering way because of the canals and just because it was built for foot traffic and maybe even horse and buggy. But the lanes, they wander. It's not like we'll see if we go to the Midwest or to California, where everything follows a grid and is very structured. These are more, I guess I'll call them organic. And so the perspective still applies, but there's a lot of leeway to establish a line that's perhaps not quite as perfect as we would use for other things. Also, some of the buildings are leaning, and if you're painting Venice, you'll pick up on that very quickly because of the settling. Some of the buildings lean, so if you have a line that's not perfectly straight, it may seem a little odd, but it's perfectly in sync with creating an image of Venice. Well, I'm starting with lighter washes and working from the top, working down, and the back, and working forward. So while this yellow ochre is drying, I've introduced a cobalt blue, and I'm letting gravity mix the colors for me. I'm trying to let watercolor do its thing and build the painting at this stage with some light undertones. These colors will likely be covered over, but I want them to kind of resound and play a role in the finished color. So I'm using some brighter color on the sides of the buildings and introducing some cool colors where I want the hues to have a shadowed effect, and a lot of warm hues on the left-hand side where the sun is striking. This is one of the crucial parts of the painting, is to keep it light and warm and have that translate into a feeling of a sunstruck surface. And of course, we're going to keep the awnings white for the moment. It may not be the finished color, but I'm going to work around those awnings to capture the shape. And this shape is a repeated shape. The awnings have sort of a rectangular shape to them. As they're close to us, they're rather large in size, and then as they move back in the painting, they diminish. So I'm keen on that, and going to capture that as I lay in the lower third of this painting, focusing on cool hues to the right-hand side, a lot of ultramarine blue, and a little bit of burnt sienna. And then as I move to the left, I'm going to add more alizarin, a warmer, redder hue, to establish sort of the pavement, the feeling of pavement and the sunstruck pavement that we're going to key on later. So this is all kind of figured into my watercolor plan. I painted this scene as a tonal painting, and now I want to translate that into colors, so I've kept the palette pretty simple. If you're curious about the colors I'm using, just have a look at the description below this video and you can see a list of the colors I'm using. Here you see the alizarin crimson now, and again this area is going to have a feeling of being sunstruck. It's not all in shadow. That's why I've made the switch to a warmer hue. Of course I could have gone with burnt sienna, but I wanted to vary it a little bit, so I thought let's use some alizarin over here and try to capture a sunstruck quality to the pavement as it contrasts against the shadowed area. Now you can see how these tones have kind of worked together to capture the awnings. And I'm using the white of the paper. The plan, my watercolor plan, is eventually to introduce some shadows onto these awnings, but for the moment I want to isolate them and get a feeling of perspective, of moving back in the painting just through the shapes. Later on this will be qualified with darker values and stronger colors coming forward, but for the moment I want the shape to kind of tell the story of a receding scene. Okay, well, the scene is dried off and you can tell, yeah, the colors have lightened quite a bit. This is perfectly fine and sort of what I had hoped for and anticipated. But now is a more difficult part of the painting where I'm using some pretty strong colors and trying to keep the brushwork lively and defining the shadow side of some of the buildings, the rooftops, some of the decorative moldings on the sides of the buildings, and all with a high contrast to the sunstruck quality of the facade of the buildings. The brush I'm using is a sable brush, not a sable, it's a squirrel mop brush, rather large, and I'm trying to keep it as large as I feel I can comfortably work because this prevents me from adjusting too much. I'm able to keep my tempo through the painting a little more comfortably if I'm using a bigger brush. Even on a stage that requires a lot of precision, such as this stage, I feel more comfortable using the bigger brush. If I really need some exacting precision, I'll let the brush fray a little bit, as you see now, and come down and hold it by the end and get control this way. And I'm counting on these elements to really communicate a sunstruck feeling. Isolate the facade a little bit. This in combination with some windows and such should give me the feeling of a bright sunstruck surface. You can almost see the perspective lines in the moldings that I'm rendering. You can feel the perspective being created by the angle of the rooftop, and you can feel that we're standing at a height, at an elevation, because we're almost level with the second story windows. What I'm doing now is using some dry brush to give a little variety to each building. In this particular building, I'm using a little bit of alizarin to stain the surface, but I'm using it in a dry fashion so that it feels weathered, or it feels textured. And this combined with a little more yellow to the next building and leaving one as it is will give me enough variety to make it feel like these buildings are separate, but yet all in the sunlight and all have a sort of weathered or aged quality to them. In this particular dry brush technique, you can tell the end of my brush is quite open because I'm pressing hard, and the hairs of the brush have splayed outward, and this gives me a more random quality to the brush mark. And also have a look at the palette. You can tell that the pigment is noticeably thicker. It's not running as quickly to the bottom as it was when I was applying these lighter washes. Even though the wash, when it went down, perhaps looked dark on the paper, if you compare that with the textural quality of the paint on the palette, you'll notice that there's quite a difference. And it's a visual cue, but I think at this stage when in my work I'm sort of relying on the tactile feel as I'm mixing the paint, so that I get a sensation more through the sense of touch than the sense of my sight seeing the color. Well, we work a little bit on the background buildings, which are in shadow, creating a feeling of a shadowed facade. And we use that darker color to heighten the drama of the sunlight on these buildings, as well as heighten the drama of our white awnings. We're going to carry this warm gray into a cool gray, and then start to drop it into the little passages between the awnings and the buildings, which are quite narrow and often packed with people, as you saw in the photograph. It's a very lively scene. I really wanted to paint it from the bridge. I was able to sketch it from the bridge, but there's so much traffic going over this bridge, and it's not just tourist traffic. There's a lot of people going to and fro to work, and I just felt I was in the way, so I did a quick sketch, took a little bit of a few photographs, and now I'm recreating that sensation, that kind of condensed, compact, busy scene, using those as a reference, and of course my memory and how it plays into this. I should say that I'm paying much more attention on my sketch than the photograph, because I feel I captured some of that in the sketch on the upper right-hand side, and keeping that in the front of my mind, and using that to help guide me through these complex areas. What you see me do now is extending that paler gray that's towards the back, bringing it into the street area, and letting it cast shadows. This shadow placement is quite important to the painting for several reasons. Number one, it's describing the angle of sun to the buildings. Number two, it's creating a really, I feel, beautiful shape in the foreground, and referring to the shadow coming off of the buildings. It's also allowing me to get a bit darker. You can tell as soon as I'm able to address that front stall, I go in with a darker mix of that ultramarine blue and a little bit of burnt sienna. And I'm going to follow that with a little bit of red as well to start to just create a feeling of some textiles in that stall. And this shadow, I'm continuing with this shadow all the way up the side of this right-hand building, unifying the passage from back to front. Of course, it's getting darker as it's coming forward, so we have a nice graded wash happening. And also it unifies all these shadow areas so that, again, it's driving our attention to the areas of the awnings and the left side buildings. Here I'm mixing it with a lot of ultramarine blue, a bit of neutral tint, and a little bit of alizarin, basically the same three colors used in the initial stage, perhaps going with a bit more blue at the bottom and a bit more, as I carry it upward, I'm going to be using a little stronger burnt sienna. You notice in this painting, I'm often going to the spray bottle. This is because I want to keep the area wet so that I can continue to blend these big passages. It's a larger piece. This piece is about half a sheet, and so I'm compartmentalizing. I am working in sections, but I want there to be a continuity through these passages, and to do that I need to have it a little wetter so that I can keep blending and keep changing in a subtle fashion. Yeah, you see I'm adding a bit more of this burnt sienna, a little bit of the cad red light that you see on my palette as I go higher in the painting. I want there to be a definite feeling of light bounce into the midsection of this building, and I want there to be a nice dark warmth at the top of the building so that we get the feeling that light is really, kind of bouncing around the scene and exaggerate that quality. Okay, the painting again has dried, and I'm returning to some areas to strengthen areas that are away from the sun. I'm going to be using some dry brush again to start to play with the windows. I need dry paper to do this, that's why I've let the building dry off. But you can start to feel the finished quality to the building. I think that you can see that the colors have dried a little paler. However, there's a nice textural quality to the buildings on the left. There's a nice feeling of a shadow on the building to the right. The awnings are still a little empty, still a little plain, but we'll get to that. What I'm doing now is just adding a few details, rooftops, chimney pots, to the back buildings so that we get just a little feeling of what it's like to look at the tops of these buildings. It's really quite entertaining. I enjoy that part. And now we'll start to place some of the windows, and this is where we can evoke that quality of perspective of windows which are smaller in the distance and get larger as they come towards us. We can use darker colors in the buildings, in the windows that are closer to us, line them up according to the lines that we placed early on. So all of the work that we did in this sketch will be made a little easier, make this process a little easier of placing windows and having them be effective in creating our sense of perspective. These windows I'm keying on quite a bit. You can tell I'm using a smaller brush. I'm still trying to evoke that dry brush, the feeling that it's a broken edge. And it's got a sort of decorative quality as well of the typical Venetian windows, which are quite exquisite, and for the painter they just give you all sorts of opportunities to create variation and interest. Right hand side too is a little steeper, so we can go with a little sharper angle. Our windows are a little more narrow since the building is a little slightly different angle to us compared to the left side. And basically I keep placing windows until I feel I've got just about enough. I could put in more. There certainly were more in the scene. I've tried to be, again, selective and add as many as is necessary and stop there, stop it kind of early. The main focal point is yet to be really established. It's going to be created after I drop some shadows onto the awnings and start to work with figures. The figures, I hope, we're going to create a center of interest right in front of the main stall. Well, the painting is dry where I'm working now, but I want to add the shadows, and I'm using basically an ultramarine blue to do that, kind of reflecting that blue in the sky. And a lot of the awnings through the middle are going to have shadow applied to them, so that the one in the foreground is going to be left a little white so that we get a real sharp focal attraction through that. This is kind of a balancing act because you want to be able to create an interesting and yet very descriptive view of the light. You can't paint everything. You have to be sort of selective, and it was very helpful for me to do this study up above to get an idea of how I can control the light by how where I leave the white parts on the awnings. It could be done at an earlier stage. I find it helpful to do it at this stage because I can relate it more to the shadows I've created on the ground and also how I want to direct the eye. And this is about where I'll stop, I think, because I feel I've got a nice movement. I left a little bit of an awning in the background white. I've kept a nice corner on this close awning white, so that really acts as a nice pull, a visual pull. And I'm going to try and extend that white a little bit as I start to create the figures. The figures are going to follow the same principle, which is we're going to build our figures a little larger in the foreground, and as they move towards the stalls and then deeper into the marketplace, they're going to get noticeably softer and smaller. So we work from front to back when we start to place the figures. Right now I'm trying to create the detail within the stall where we see some tapestries or silks or different things that they would sell at the marketplace. We see them on display and give a little reference to them, even though this is largely in shadow. Having a little bit of detail is important for the final stage of this painting. Right now, using a very small brush and placing marks that are very important right under the awning of this stall so that it really comes forward and captures our attention, and then we can be a little more vague, a little less precise in the background. If we capture the foreground here, that sort of image will be applied to the rest of the stalls. We'll understand what's going on in the background by virtue of really doing a good job in the foreground. Well, you can see I've started to isolate a few figures standing in front of the stall using a similar hue of ultramarine blue, a little bit of neutral tint, working on dry paper, adding figures now. If you notice, my technique is basically to place a blob of color that I'll either add legs to or head to or blend in to the group. So this wasn't apparent in the beginning of the video that I was going to focus on this area, but all the work I was doing prior to this has kind of led up to this point where I can throw in some very strong color, dark tones into an area where I want to visual draw, where I want you to see the figures and have that translate into a busy scene with a lot of figures, main figures kind of in front of the stall and coming towards us, minor figures to the periphery, and certainly very minor as they move back in the painting. Since the figures are small, we don't have to include a lot of detail. If we can get the semblance of a torso and the tilt of a head, we can also communicate by the direction they're facing or the direction that they're walking. We do this by how we move, or how we balance the body with the head leaning towards the direction it's moving, how the shoulders are foreshortened, etc. And we just continue to drop in figures and bringing them forward now, adding a few larger figures towards the bottom of the painting so that we, again, this is another device to create depth in the painting. My main figures, while they're sort of in the lower third, these larger figures coming out of towards the bottom of the painting are important to create a feeling of depth, especially if you relate it to the smaller figures in the distance. That combination gives us a more convincing portrayal of depth in the painting. Okay, well, I'm going to zoom in and show you a little more closely how I'm dealing with the figures. You can see that in terms of brush strokes, it's basically a torso with a suggestion of the legs coming off. I'm adding some opaque, well, it's not even really opaque color. It is opaque color, but it's transparent watercolor right out of the tube. Used some lavender where you see the blues. I've used a bit of the cad red light that's on my palette for the dress and other parts of the figures. Putting a bit of orange into the faces, especially faces that I want you to recognize as coming towards us or looking in our direction. And they're spread out in a little bit of a chaotic fashion, which is really important when you're doing figures, to have uneven spacings and stagger figures, group figures in some areas, let them kind of wander in others, with a kind of convergence on these three figures that are in front of the stall. I'm adding some highlights using a color by Holbein called Jaune brilliant, which is brilliant yellow. It's basically got some white with a bit of yellow ochre. Well, this is the finished painting, and I think we did a pretty good job capturing the marketplace. I like the feeling of the energy and certainly the quality of light. Well, thank you for joining me today. I hope this video was instructive and gave you some idea on how to look at your motif and look for these lines that are invisible, but that will help you to align windows, help you to align figures and repeating elements and the like. I recommend you have a look below at the description where you'll see a list of the materials used in this painting. You'll find a playlist at the end of this video that joins similar videos that I've made. And there's a PDF that's included that will clarify and present some of the ideas that I'm talking about in a little more detail. So all these things are available to you if you look at the description. So next week I'm still in Venice, and I'm going to be painting a slightly different view of the particular bridge that I'm standing on and looking at the marketplace in this scene. So join me next week and we'll be painting watercolors again in Venice.